When the Vulcan was first introduced into service, the concept of operations was that it would fly most of its missions at high altitude. That would keep it out of the way of most of the Soviet air defences, but it would leave the aircraft potentially vulnerable to fighters, not least because rearward visibility from the Vulcan was so poor. So the aircraft was designed with a tail warning radar in the boom just above me here. The original version of that was a system called Orange Putter, designed actually for the English Electric Canberra, but that system was so poor that it was deemed to be pretty much unusable. So it was eventually replaced with a system called Red Steer. Now, Red Steer Mark I was based on the AI-20 radar, originally intended for use in the English Electric Lightning. Had a range of about 10 miles, covering a cone of sort of 45 degrees behind the aircraft. And it meant that the air electronics officer could monitor the airspace behind the aircraft, see any enemy fighters coming up, and give them time to alert the captain, take evasive manoeuvring action if necessary. The Vulcan could turn really well at high altitude because of its big delta wing, and for the AEO to dispense any countermeasures that they thought might be necessary. Eventually, the Mark II Red Steer was introduced, which increased the range out to about 25 to 30 nautical miles and improved the display of the system so that it was much more user-friendly and easier to interpret. The reason all this was important was because the fighters at the time had early air-to-air missiles. They were fairly short range and they could only be fired from the rear hemisphere because they had uncooled lead sulfide sensors that meant they had to be able to lock on directly to the heat source from the jet pipe. So they had to get fairly close and fairly close to line astern from the aircraft in order to be able to fire those missiles. So being able to monitor that airspace behind the aircraft gave the AEO sufficient time to be able to implement countermeasures between himself and the pilots to keep the aircraft safe. The air electronics officer was positioned on the port side of the aircraft behind the captain's seat, and his responsibilities fell into several categories. He looked after the electronics in the aircraft, he looked after countermeasures and communications. And countermeasures in terms of the Blue Steer radar were a big part of keeping the aircraft safe. So from the position here, the air electronics officer was able to monitor the airspace behind the aircraft, and then if he detected an enemy aircraft coming into a position to target the Vulcan, he could call the captain could take evasive manoeuvres, the AEO could deploy countermeasures from back here, and hopefully that would be enough to keep the aircraft safe.